actually, the last person who's going to be speaking today is one of our participants who has been here and has offered to prepare a presentation. So her name is Johanna Gusman. Is that the correct pronunciation? Johanna Gusman. And she's going to talk about combating sexual and gender-based violence in Ecuador's refugee population, a proposal for a gender-focused approach to local integration. Are you ready to start? Mm-hmm. Okay, please join me in a warm welcome for Johanna Gusman.
Okay, so I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse to be the final presenter on 4:30 on a Friday, but I do get the last say on what I think is a very important topic. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank all of the organizers of the London Human Rights Congress for allowing me to present this working paper. And it is just that. It is a working paper, so I by no means claim to be an expert on this. And actually, I kind of want this presentation to be a little bit different than other ones that we've seen because we have such a wealth of experience and knowledge and cultural diversity in this room. I'm going to be posing questions to you all, and I want you to ask me questions too, and I really want to make this an interactive dialogue. As you may have heard, I am right now interning at the UNHCR in Geneva at the headquarters, and we're really big on the interactive dialogue part, so I'm going to be testing that on you guys today. Everyone in this room should care about what's going on in Ecuador, particularly if you are interested in keeping safe immigration policies and refugee law. And I say this because we want to prevent Ecuador from being the example of why not to open your borders and why not to have liberal refugee policies and whatnot, because that's exactly where things are headed if something isn't done about the situation right now. Luckily, I think I have the answer. I may be biased, but I think that combating sexual and gender-based violence in Ecuador's refugee population through the implementation of a gender-focused immigration policy helps to do two things. It helps to first solve the displacement problem, and second, solve the gender-based violence problem that we have there. Do I just push the... I don't know if it's attached to them. Okay, here we go. So in true lawyerly fashion, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do before I do it, so there's no surprises. We're going to go over the background and the context of the issue, and then I'm going to set out the proposal that I have and the three reasons why. And then we're going to talk about what the UNHCR has coined as the tripartite process of implementation of local integration, and then end with the conclusion, which is basically the transformation of the community via successful local integration. So first and foremost, how many of you, by show of hands, have heard of sexual and gender-based violence? I had never necessarily heard about it until I went to a UNHCR thing, but I mean, it's a broad term, and you're going to hear me say SGBV, it's truncated version, but I don't always like to use acronyms because I feel like it separates really the context of the issue from what it is, because you put it down into a mush of letters and you lose what it is. And I want us to really be sensitive to the issue and know that we're talking about a very, very big issue of oppression. And so I'm going to try to be as good as I can to use those terms wisely, but I know if I keep on saying sexual and gender-based violence, we'll be here past 5. None of us want that. And then how many of you know what local integration is? I'm assuming the majority of us hasn't. We had papers about it before, but it's one of the 3 durable solutions that UNHCR has come up with to the refugee issue. And it's actually the most realistic of all of them. I don't know if we've gone over any of the numbers, but resettlement is only available to very, very fortunate few of refugees, and my country, the United States, is actually the #1 country for resettlement, but we only resettled total 37,000 refugees, and we're the best country, and there are 8 million millions of refugees, and we only resettled 37,000. So local integration is actually one of the most realistic of these solutions, and one of rarely used properly. So in the context of this paper, because sexual and gender-based violence is very difficult to quantify, certainly in legal terms, and very difficult to even describe, there's a video that I want to share with you all. How many people have ever heard of the girl effect and seen any of the videos? Okay, this is good, because this is a wonderful video, and it very much frames the issue and how I want all of us to be thinking about it. So as we dive into this conversation, I want us to keep this video in the back of our heads as we do it. Yeah, I think you have to push play. I think you just click. So, I mean, that's a pretty powerful video, and I really suggest that you guys, it's just girleffect.org, and you can download it and share it, because I think the message there is really crucial, and it takes all of our sort of thinking, it takes it out of the box, and it requires sort of a refocusing of the issue, and especially in Latin America and Ecuador, and this refugee crisis we have going on, I think this really is key, because, I mean, this focus on girls in poverty, but, I mean, all of us know here, refugees live in poverty, and this is certainly a really innovative approach to solving the problem. Now, just sort of putting this in context of the refugee issue in Latin America. Unlike necessarily Sudan or Iraq situations, the 5.4 million displaced people in Latin America rarely grab headlines. And it's really unfortunate. The problem is particularly severe at the Colombian and Ecuador border. We heard from the Guatemalan ambassador earlier on today. The drug war in Colombia is displacing millions, has displaced millions, and Ecuador, through its really positive sort of immigration policies of having open doors or whatever, has taken on the brunt of those refugees. But as the violence seeps through the porous borders, we're starting to see a constriction of those policies. And then, of course, if we begin to see closed borders, it's only going to compound the problem. And then, so between Colombia and Ecuador, there are 4.3 million persons of concern that the UNHCR has identified. And they also estimate that around 1,850 persons per month are fleeing to the border. So that's really where a lot of the focus of this policy papers is, because that's where we see a lot of the protection concerns arising and a lot of widespread sexual and gender-based violence. But another important thing that policy makers often tend to forget or choose not to realize is that the overwhelming majority of these persons of concern are women and children. Overwhelming, you'll see, because my paper is a working paper, that there are a few numbers I can't give. I'm privy to a lot of information at UNHCR, but a lot of these papers haven't gone public until the end of the year. So if you do choose to read my paper, just keep that in mind. That's why it'll seem a little bit disjointed. But the numbers are staggering, and they're only rising as the issues in the internal conflict in Colombia are not being addressed, and people are forced to leave their homes. But in a lot of ways, Ecuador is a model country for local integration. So not only did I talk about them having an open border policy, but there are no refugee camps in Ecuador. The refugees live among the local communities in what is sort of termed like an urban refugee area. They do have access to the healthcare and education systems and whatnot. And of course, this is on paper, they have access, and the laws allow for these things. But as we see very often in law, the translation of that on the ground leaves much to be desired. I think in order to sort of understand my paper, it requires, I guess, what I like to call expounding thinking. My background is actually in science. I have a master's in biophysics and physiology. So I tend to analyze problems maybe backwards from the usual legal way. I want to look at the population first. I want to see what is it that these laws are, what are the gaps? What are the vulnerabilities of these populations? And really, what can we do as lawyers, as people who are meant to protect this population? What can we do to actually make sure that that's happening? So that brings me to the first reason of this gender-focused approach, and that is the demographics simply make it so necessitates that we have a local integration policy that looks first and foremost at women and children, and really focusing on, like we saw earlier, a 12-year-old girl. When I talk about the demographics, we've got 73% of the persons of concern that have been identified in Ecuador are women and children, and of that 45% are children, and the majority of that are girls. And the numbers have changed. This was 2010, and they've only risen from this past year. So logic implies that the policies that we put forth need to keep that in mind. Secondly, and we heard this a little bit before in some other papers, the idea of self-reliance is very necessary if we're going to locally integrate thousands of people from a separate population into a local community. Because if you don't have policies that further self-reliance, then all you're doing is transplanting a community and putting them into another one and making them reliant on the social welfare system, which is only going to burden the state and compound the problem. And then thirdly, positive consequences for the Ecuadorian society as a whole. Obviously, sexual and gender-based violence isn't only focused on Colombian refugee women and children. It involves Ecuadorian women as well, with whom the population is being integrated. So by having policies that focus on combating sexual and gender-based violence, you're creating a net positive result for everyone. So as we go into this, I just want to sort of open the discussion to the group and sort of give an idea of the issue. So if you were at the border of Colombia and Ecuador, and the situation, I think, is quite grim. Literally, you can find on the border there signs that say, "The FARC welcomes you." The illegal Colombian drug lords have signs at the border saying, "We welcome you to the country." It's not like in the States, you cross the state border, it's like Connecticut welcomes you, Virginia welcomes you. This is the FARC welcoming people who are crossing the border. So when we're thinking about this, and 8 out of every 10 people who cross the border are women and children with specific vulnerabilities. What kind of vulnerabilities do you think we're talking about? What comes to mind? Especially any lawyers in here who have had any kind of experience with RSD, refugee status determinations, or anything like that. What comes to mind as specific vulnerabilities of women and children? Anybody?
Also, having crossed the border, that specific border myself,
Okay.
first thing that comes to mind if you're kind of a refugee woman and child is there's quite a large space on each side of no man's land,
Exactly.
which is the most scariest thing in the world, about 5 miles on each side,
Mm-hmm.
and there are people cruising around with guns on their shoulders in pickup trucks, and the first thing you think is, where am I, what am I going to do, how am I going to get to any form of civilization? That's
Yeah.
the biggest thing.
Complete lack of protection for an entire thing. I heard human trafficking, absolute number one concern. Human traffickers prey on the refugee population, actually, and it's quite extensive. Anything else? Just vulnerabilities of women and children in general. Rape, sexual or gender-based violence. Domestic violence.
Mostly principal applicants are like male in the family, so they think that refugee status determination is depending on the relationship with the husband, so they can't really talk about it.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that UNHCR really pushes is sort of this gender-sensitive approach to RSD and interview situations where to have a woman who, the majority of people who flee Colombia are also fleeing due to sexual and gender-based violence-related issues, then to only become, once again, victims of SGBV in their asylum state. And so if you have a woman who has just been through traumatic issues from a male, and then you put her in front of an interviewer who is male, how can you expect her to open up to anything? Or really one of the major concerns in Ecuador and Colombia is unaccompanied children. Children who have lost their families traveling, and what do you do when when a boy or girl comes and they don't have a family and they don't know what asylum is or what international protection means, and they're being put in detention centers with adults, and then you're sort of creating the cycle even more. So there are, of course, major issues of vulnerabilities that oftentimes aren't necessarily thought of. Health is another major issue. A lot of sexual and gender-based violence you have to have sensitive healthcare systems that deal with the issue. And then, okay, where am I? Sorry. Yeah, the psychological issues. I don't know where the girl went, but she was talking about it earlier. I mean, obviously, these are people who've been through traumatic situations, and we have to have built into the system a sensitivity to that. Okay, so this tripartite process, thank you, of implementation that UNHCR has coined is dealing with the legal, economic, and social dimensions of bringing in and integrating refugees within the local communities. And obviously my paper could go into thousands of different areas of how to do this, but being the scientist that I am at heart, I am just outlining 3 key things that really would help the majority of the population when it comes to these things, and then of course we can expound from there. But the very first and basic part of it is the legal dimension of social integration, which is about getting these people the legal documentation so that they are legally protected from a humanitarian status, from a refugee status, from so on and so forth. Ecuador really has sort of a more liberal policy on this. So the 1951 definition of a refugee is very much came about after World War II, and a lot of it is still deals with what our conceptions were of a refugee back from 1951 versus sort of newer laws that are coming around, and one that Ecuador has where you can gain international protection solely on the basis of a generalized violence in your country of origin, and that's the law that Ecuador has, and that's why it has one of the highest the highest recognition rate of refugees in Latin America, although that is declining as the violence is seeping in. But when we think about documentation, I don't want us to just think about, okay, we're giving them a paper, yay, you've got international protection, everything's fine, because obviously that isn't what happens. But when we focus a local integration policy on combating sexual and gender-based violence, this means from the get-go, for documentation, we're thinking about these vulnerabilities that we sort of listed before. So that means when we have these people coming for seeking asylum, that we have policies built within the laws that not only says that, you know, human trafficking is one of the ways you can get international protection, but we actually are able to identify somebody who's been trafficked. It's very, very rarely will you ever walk into a situation and they're like, hi, I come from Colombia, I've been trafficked. I mean, that doesn't happen. People don't even know how, you know, oftentimes how they get it, let alone children. And then, of course, women who have been through traumatic issues. And so when it comes to having the legal dimension of local integration, being focused on documentation, Ecuador was actually one of the 8 countries on the for the pilot countries for UNHCR's global needs assessment, and they went into a number of different countries, but Ecuador was one of them, and said, okay, what really are the refugee needs? How can we focus our policy on something that works? And the number 1 refugee need in Ecuador was documentation, because oftentimes if you don't have legal status, you don't have access to other levels of protection concerns. So the next level is the economic dimension of local integration. And this one, I think, is absolutely crucial, especially when it comes to making this a tool to fight against sexual and gender-based violence. So what oftentimes happens is what has been termed survival sex. So women come, they flee, they get their documentation, they have no means of providing for their family. They have no means of doing anything. We've talked about this throughout the conference. You know, how do we get jobs? How do we, you know, have it so they're self-sustaining? This is it right here. And actually, sex work in Ecuador is legal. And For a number of reasons, that may be a positive thing when it comes to policies, because the idea is you are trying to contain spread of sexually transmitted diseases, and so by making it legal, you're adding a regulatory state level into this and can make sex workers get tested and things like that. But what we see is actually happening on the ground is that when the police go in and raid these legal brothels, they're arresting sex workers. And over half of the Colombian refugee women who come to Ecuador go into sex work. And so it's the Colombian refugee women who are being arrested, detained, and then oftentimes, once again, dealing with sexual and gender-based violence once they're detained. So it's just this horrific cycle, and unless we focus these issues on having economic opportunity be looked at not only as a way to make refugees self-sustaining, but as a way to actually combat survival sex, and make that a focus of an integration policy, then we would be losing one of the major ways of helping these women get out of their situations. And there's a number of ways that we can do this that I outline in my paper, but it takes a lot from the international community to give microfinance programs, to create community-based organizations that help to have the whole community work together around sort of farming initiatives towards, whatever it is that the population has as a resource that can do it. And a lot of actually the issues in Ecuador also deal with mining and oil companies that are seen at the border. But that, of course, could be an entire other paper. Finally, we have the social level of local integration. And this is sort of the idea of community development. And going back to the video that we saw earlier, I really believe that women have a natural sort of ability to be people who nurture and can be the focus of actually making community development issues and local integration, where you need to have people who can be emotionally capable of, and not meaning to be like, and men don't know how to do this, but I think a lot of times when we think about community development, we leave an untapped resource of women having a natural capacity for these issues. We forget about that. And especially in the context of sexual and gender-based violence, where we need to have women helping women, where we need to have, childcare being a part of issues, so that people can actually go to get schooling they need, or language classes or whatnot. That's a key thing that we oftentimes forget. And of course, I go into this a lot more in my paper, but really the idea of everything is that, I'm sorry, where we come? Thank you. The government of Ecuador determines what their local integration strategy ultimately will be, but if they don't, as oftentimes most governments do not, they don't really go to the issue of sexual and gender-based violence and the oppression of women systematically, especially the vulnerable populations like refugee women and children, then any local integration strategy isn't going to work, because you're not addressing the problem. And of course there are other problems. Of course we have issues of racism and xenophobia and things that we have talked about here, but oftentimes this gets forgotten, and it's oftentimes a subset or a bullet point within an entire policy. And my paper argues for the local integration strategy to be the strategy of combating sexual and gender-based violence within a local community. And so we'll end with that.
So thank you very much. It's not going to work.
Or you can use this one.
So, does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, it's just when did this particular refugee crisis originate?
Whew. That is a great question, because I think a lot of people would argue it's been around for a while. A lot of times when you do read about this issue in the media, it's sometimes been referred to as the invisible refugee population, and that's for a number of reasons. But I think in Latin America in general, and Africa too, has been this way, where you have a lot more of the governments and the communities being willing to make it a solidarity issue, of countries being like, okay, you know, we are in this together. There's a lot of regional agreements made and things like that, but really the major refugee crisis has been going on since the 90s, since really the Colombian drug war hit its sort of peak and has still been going on. But it's oftentimes not been publicized.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Well, I have a number of things I'd love to talk to you about, but I guess for the sake of time, could you clarify, did you mean that Ecuador has actually ratified the international refugee law into its national legislation? This is actually very rare. And,
Yeah, no, it is very rare. I decided to skip over the portions of my paper that went into the legal and normative framework for Ecuador, because I think we've had enough of that for the week. But yes, they have ratified, and there's actually a number of regional things: the Mexico Plan of Action, the Brasilia Declaration, that just continues to broaden the definition of a refugee and allow international protection for more and more people. And then, of course, it's a matter of whether it's actually realized on the ground or not. One of the actual really innovative things that Ecuador has is that it allows for the police to take asylum claims. They're not doing the RSD, but they are allowed to refer people to the refugee department of Ecuador. So it sort of acts as another arm of trying to bring in protection needs of the population. A lot of it being because of the border situation, where a lot of people just need protection immediately as they come in, and whether or not that is actually being utilized is a question, but it's sort of another innovative approach.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is already part of your paper, but and whether it's even possible given the circumstances, but is there resources for women that will help them learn about domestic violence? Because from training I've done on domestic violence, like you said about trafficked people, women who are victims of domestic violence don't usually or often even know.
Yeah.
And could that be a helpful part of the program and your strategy?
Absolutely. Like I said, it's a working paper, but that is one of the points of sort of the social and community development, and why it is something that's positive for the whole Ecuadorian community. There is very much a lack of shelters in Ecuador for domestic violence, but actually UNHCR has partnered with community or local governments on what they call, it's escaping me, but it's like in English it would be like everybody together or something, where it talks about domestic violence in the home and what it means, and just like you stated correctly, a lot of these women just don't even know that they're in abusive situations. They just think it's part of their natural lives. And so if a local immigration policy has built within it reception centers and domestic shelters that are also available and obviously available to the Ecuadorian women, you're sort of killing two birds with one stone or whatnot. It really is also helping to bring in a framework that doesn't exist right now for the local communities as well. which is a key part in helping refugees be integrated when communities can see it as a positive for themselves as well.
Thanks. I'm a man. And so one of the things that first jumps to my mind is that young boys and men, of course, are also vulnerable and subject to sort of rape and enslavement and all these other kinds of things. So when I hear that the proposal is a gender-based solution, I do react to that because I feel that if the problem is rape, for example, then there should be sort of focus on that as a problem. So what I'm wondering is, clearly you have to have a special appreciation for women in a vulnerable situation, and by far it's the massive majority of people who are subject to those kinds of things. So what I'm wondering though is that there is a bit of a risk if we fragment refugee populations that we will then appreciate certain elements of the refugee population in certain ways that we don't look at it as a group as a whole. So I'm wondering how is this sort of integrated into the larger refugee assessment? And again, keeping in mind things like the 12-year-old boy who's been raped and trafficked, etc.
Absolutely. And that's a great question, and I'm glad you bring it up because I think one of the major parts of combating sexual and gender-based violence isn't separating out men and boys and being like, you're the problem, get out of here, because part of the issue is educating men and boys to not be victims or perpetrators of the violence themselves. And that really is a heart of the issue. And so a lot of the policies need to be focused on education. I am a firm believer that education is one of the best ways of changing communities. And I do appreciate that, yes, we don't want to be fragmenting an already fragmented population, but at the same time, the overwhelming majority are women. And I think that it is sort of an untapped resource, and I would like to see a policy that actually goes forth and can see what happens if we were to implement it as a gender-focused thing, because frankly I don't think that policies do that. And I think that there are enough policies that come from a male-dominated society that create massive gaps in the population. And not that we need to be testing these things on the Ecuadorian refugee population, but I think that it is key in extreme situations like that to focus on the needs of the specific population, in this case overwhelmingly the majority women and children.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to take more questions?
Yeah, I mean, if people still want to ask.
I really like this initiative of proposing this gender-focused approach. I would like to know if this approach could be applied to other refugee populations. For example, if you take into consideration Kosovo, my home country, where during the war of 1999 there has been, if I can say, double domestic violence, because while the refugees were in the camps, human trafficking occurred in massive numbers, because women who had been raped in Kosovo while being in, for example, Macedonian camps, the refugee camps, they have been doubly raped because there was like human trafficking in order to help them in a way integrate into other countries. In a way, these women were called by human traffickers to go abroad in a way to seek better life, but instead they were just being
Yeah.
So I really like, and these women, many of them who have come back to Kosovo, they still live in, there are approximately estimated about 10,000 women who have been raped during the war, and they still live in trauma and haven't seeked and haven't been integrated into local society because of the fear that they will be still again trafficked and again going through the same situation. So I really would like to know if this approach could be also applied to these populations as well.
I think that absolutely it could, and I think ideally it should. And of course, this is just a working paper. This is not UNHCR's policy even. And it's the way that this actually paper came about was I actually sit with the sexual and gender-based violence unit of UNHCR. We all share an office. And I'm the human rights unit. And I, of course, women's issues is something that I obviously believe in. And so when I'm still a law student in the States and I have to write a comment for my journal, and then I'm, at UNHCR, and then I'm with this. So when I was sort of coming up with ideas of what to do and everything was coming together, this sort of came about because of it. But I mean, I think if you saw the research, you would be shocked at just how little SGBV is part of policies, especially when it comes to a situation like Kosovo, where, just like you stated, it's very true, a double sort of discrimination or re-trafficking situations or things like that are rarely ever brought in. And even within UNHCR documents, these are, people who are right there on the front lines. And so I think, hopefully this will be published through UNHCR's PDES thing, and you guys can bring it back to your countries. And, by no means is this, a revolutionary idea. I think it is just something that more people need to be thinking about.
Yeah. I think that what fuels SGBV, two things, basically, ignorance,
yeah,
and poverty.
Yes.
Maybe the two are so linked. And so when we get rid of ignorance through, for instance, education, less of that will happen. And also when the economic part of life is taken care of, less of that will also happen. But I want you to think of this. Whenever we talk on this kind of topic, we always imagine that the men are the perpetrators.
Right.
But in reality, you also discover that the women, perhaps 75% are also the perpetrators. And I can give you instances of, let's take, for instance, what you call female genital mutilation, for which some other people would argue against, are hardly ever done by men against women. It's done by women against women, mothers against their daughters, cultural environment for whatever reason. And also prostitution. Sometimes you discover that it's the mothers who sell their daughters to go and prostitute. Recently I watched a documentary about a Taiwanese girl who was sold to an American family when she was 4 years old or thereabout, and she was sold into slavery and then sexual exploitation and all that. The mother actually sold her to that. So we need to begin to reconstruct our minds. Sometimes, just like you said, that's another perspective to it. Maybe women talking to more women now, educating us now better can help to solve this problem.
I think that's absolutely true. And maybe I want to clarify my wording, and maybe I can change this since it is a working paper. When I use the term gender-focused approach, I'm not meaning that men are the perpetrators, and I mean that it's literally a gender-focused approach where the person of concern for these policies that we are thinking about when we make them is the girl child, and the sort of positive things that can come out because we focus on that. And I do appreciate what you said. Of course, it's not just girls that are raped, boys are raped. And of course, it's not just men perpetrating SGBV. It's actually a large population, women on women. Actually, the majority of the brothel owners in Ecuador are women. And I think that is absolutely key, your last point about women needing to increase the dialogue within women, with it, you know, women to women, and that's why when I focus on the social, the community development part, it has to be women, both refugee and non-refugee, mothers, daughters, whatever it is, they have to be the ones that are helping each other through this. Because yes, there are parts of sexual and gender-based violence, especially when it's perpetrated by a male, that it's a lot harder to have men be a part of it versus a woman being a part of it. And certainly, especially psychological counselors and whatnot. And especially with unaccompanied children, having their whoever is assigned to taking over their case being somebody who's sensitive to this.
Yes.
Okay, one more question.
I have a comment. As a father and as a grandfather, one daughter, two granddaughters, there is nothing redeeming about prostitution. There's nothing redeeming about offering a woman a safe haven in a whorehouse. Nothing at all. I was kind of stunned at that statement you made, you know? And
It's not, yeah, that's definitely not what I meant.
well, I mean, what did you say?
I was just saying that on the regulatory part of it, the reason why sex work is legalized from the government standpoint is a regulation for sexual and sexually transmitted diseases to be regulated.
Well, I mean,
By no means.
well, I mean, maybe you just rephrased it, but you didn't say it. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, but
Then I
it's
definitely
okay.
didn't mean that.
It's okay. So we agree on that.
Of course.
You know, and okay. So, Chris, you know, there may be women out here who are involved in the mutilation of women, but in the end, the political power rests with men, and we live in a male-dominated society. And if that were the case, that women were out here mutilating women and the men were against it, then they could enact laws to prevent that, and they could actively do something about that. So I think the onus, in the first instance, is on the society and those people who hold the political power in that society. So I think that, you know, for instance, the question of like, you know, it's strange here. You know, for me, I mean, as people know here, I'm a ex-soldier, former soldier, and I've seen prostitution, you know, in many different forms, not only in a war zone, but also in Detroit. During this crack epidemic, you know, women selling every sexual favor or service just to get a hit on the crack pipe, you know, and 9 times out of 10, it's men who are responsible for that. All right, so I don't think we should fool ourselves about that particular situation. And you know, what to me is also missing here, you know, for instance, President what's his name, Bill Clinton, you know, that was sexual exploitation. No matter what Monica Lewinsky had to say about it, but some kind of way he got away with it. And that particular phenomenon is something that also needs to be addressed. We have up and down the ladder, all right, people who are responsible for the sexual exploitation of women, from the police station,
Yes.
You know, to the street, you know, just like in the case of Belgium. I mean, we only have to look there, you know. So this problem is widespread. It's widespread, and the issue is very difficult to deal with, and I think we just have to open up that discussion, you know, and call a spade a spade.
Agreed.
Can I make a quick
Okay, actually, I'm afraid
No.
I'm going to I'm afraid, but I can't think of a better way to finish the day and the whole conference. So thank you very much once again.